You perhaps feel safest when you are in your own bed, underneath the blankets, under the silent cover of night. But this is also the time when you feel most vulnerable. It is not without reason that children cry out in the night about a monster hidden underneath their beds. We all fear the bogeyman and the chance that he might be lurking in the dark shadows of the night. And for some, this fear becomes reality. Hello and welcome back to Certainly Strange. This episode is the first episode of the second season and I am just so excited to share all new stories with you. Just a small administrative comment before we start the story. So in the previous season, at the end of each episode, I have told you to go to the website drnemuscabinetofcuriosities.com to find all my research and the articles and everything about the podcast. And this website has now changed to certainlystrange.com. So if you want to read along with the transcript of this episode and find the sources of my research and all of that, you can go to certainlystrange.com. I also have some smaller administrative things to say about the coming season, but that will be after the story. For now, grab a hot drink and your favorite snack. Get cozy under a blanket, because this one is gruesome. Happy Halloween. Built in 1868, 508 E 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa, is a small but pretty house, completely painted white with a grey roof and a staircase leading up to the front door. It seems the perfect home for a family to live in peacefully and safe. But if it wasn't for the sign up front, no one would have guessed that this house was the site of a murder that counted 8 victims and which was so strange that it is left unsolved to this very day. But first, let's go back to 1903, when Joshua B. Moore bought a house and moved into it with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. Joshua was a businessman and Sarah was very involved in church. This was why they were at church on the evening on June 9, 1912. 2 daughters of a local farmer, who were friends of Catherine, Lena and Ina Stinninger, had asked whether they could spend the night at the Moores family's house, and the parents had agreed, a choice that they would later come to regret very, very much. After church, the Moore family alongside the Stillinger sisters went home, locked the door behind them and went to bed. The next morning, Mary Peckham, the neighbour, noticed that the house of the Moore family remained quiet, even though they were supposed to be up and about doing their daily things. She became increasingly more worried, and when no one answered her knocking on the door, Mary decided to call Joshua's brother, Ross. Ross immediately came to the house, opening the door with his spare key, and stepping inside, what he found was a scene right out of a nightmare. First, he entered the room where the little guests had been sleeping, Lena and Ina. Their faces had strangely been covered by their clothes, soaked with blood. When Ross removed the clothes from their faces, he found that the heads of the little girls had been chopped open with an axe. A spectacle so repulsive that it was almost beyond comprehension that 6 more victims, murdered in identically the same fashion, lay in the 2 bedrooms upstairs. There were 8 victims to a murder no one had any idea had occurred. No one had heard or seen a thing during the evening, the night, or the early morning, despite the neighbour Mary already being up from around 4:30. All victims had been murdered in their sleep, except one. Lena Stinninger appeared to have raised her arm before her attacker landed the blow of the axe, apparently trying to defend herself. Thus far, this story is simply of a terrible, terrible murder. But this is where the facts get a bit strange. In the bedroom of Lena and Ina, a 2-pound slab of raw bacon was found on the floor right next to the bed where the bodies lay, carefully wrapped in a dish towel. And this was just the first one of many strange habits this killer seemed to have. The murderer had also covered all mirrors in the house with sheets, and, as mentioned before, all the faces of the victims had also been covered with clothing or bedding. All the curtains of all the windows of the house were also closed. Though I'm personally not a specialist in criminology or psychology, I have seen enough episodes of Criminal Minds to understand that all of these things, all of these strange habits of the killer point to a feeling of shame and a certain remorse for their actions. The killer cannot look at themselves in the mirror and is afraid to see his victims' faces, and he clearly was afraid that someone else might witness him doing his terrible act. In an episode of BuzzFeed Unsolved, where they visit the house where these murders were committed, they try to communicate with the ghost of the killer through a spirit box, and during some of these sessions, a voice can be heard in the spirit box saying, "Release me, hard to stop," and "Stop me." Now, I don't know how much you believe in ghosts and their ability to talk to the living through machines like the spirit box, but I did find it very interesting and also strangely specific and targeted to the same feelings of remorse that are evident in the covered mirrors, in the covered faces and the closed window curtains. But then there is the thing about the breakfast. You see, food was found on the kitchen table alongside a bunch of cigarette butts on the floor, suggesting that the killer had took his time eating breakfast and smoking after he had killed everyone in the house. Now, this speaks of a certain confidence and a relaxed state of mind that all the other parts of the evidence do not point at all. And why would the ghost of a killer stick around in a place where he has successfully done his deed and went unpunished? It is all very, very strange, even if you don't believe in ghosts. The motives of the murders was unclear. Nothing was stolen. But Joshua was the only victim that was murdered with the sharp part of the axe. The other victims were bludgeoned to death, but he was cut. The Axeman also swung the axe with such force when murdering Joshua that he actually cut a hole in the wall behind him that you can still see to this day. So the murderer seemed to target his anger specifically to Joshua, though that does not mean that he was angry with Joshua specifically, or whether he had simply a hatred for what he stood for example, being a businessman or being a father. From what they found on BuzzFeed Unsolved, the voice in the spirit box, it points to a killer who does not actually want to kill, but someone who is unable to stop himself. Again, I take ghost evidence with a grain of salt, but it is a thing to consider. And then there's the question of how the killer got inside the house. Apparently there were no signs of breaking and entering, so either the killer already possessed a key of the house, or perhaps even worse, he was already inside the house when the family got home. One final strange thing to discuss about these terrible murders is not what happened that night, but what happened years and years after that. But first, the announcement that I was talking about at the start of the episode. So recently, Certainly Strange has joined the BooPod network, which is a group of fantastic podcasters who all have similar podcasts that I'm sure you would enjoy. So from next episode on, you will be hearing from one of them through a short trailer where they basically tell you what their podcast is all about. So if you like this podcast and you're looking for other podcasts to listen to, because you can never listen to enough podcasts, I'm sure you will enjoy each and every one of the BooPod network. On November 7th, 2014, a 50-year-old man came to stay in the house overnight. Though he was completely alone that entire night, the next morning the caretaker of the house found the man stabbed with his own knife in the room where Lena and Ina had been murdered. The knife had been jabbed into his chest, and the man could not remember what had happened that night. People consider that he has stabbed himself, and the caretaker of the house also thinks that the man stabbed himself and that he was not in fact attacked by the ghost of the Axeman. But he also believes that the house might have influenced the man's mental state, sort of how the Overlook Hotel influenced the mind of Jack in The Shining. I said before that this murder has gone unsolved, and that is true to a certain point. There was, however, a man who once did confess to the murders. His name was Reverend George Kelly, who had left the village the morning following the night of the murders by train, and in the train he spoke to people about how 8 people had been murdered in their sleep back home, despite the news about the murders not being public yet. He returned to the village 2 weeks later, posing as a detective and getting involved in a murder case by joining a tour through the house. Having knowledge about a murder before it is in the news and trying to get involved in an investigation are all things that, are the behavior of a killer. And of course, there is his confession. He later recanted his confession, but apparently the reason that he said that he had murdered all these people is because he had heard voices in his head that he believed belonged to God. Personally, I am not entirely sure whether George Kelly is the killer, simply because someone who is a priest and who believes that he is acting in the name of God when he killed these people, he would not show this deep remorse by covering their faces and the mirrors and closing the curtains. He would be proud of his work, I think, but again, I am not a criminologist or anything like that. These are just my theories. And I would actually love to hear your theories about this entire business. If you have an opinion, please contact me via social media. My Instagram is Certainly Strange the Podcast. Please just send me a DM. I would really, really like to hear what you thought about this entire thing. But yeah, these were my theories. And now there are a lot of people that think that the house is haunted, and I again don't know what your opinion is about ghosts and hauntings. I personally do believe that ghosts can exist if they are like an echo of a brutal happening, like a murder. So if a house would be haunted, I would reckon that this is definitely one that could be haunted, but I'm not entirely sure whether the ghost of the killer would be here, and why would he be, because he got away with it, so why would he be haunted by this so that he returns to it? I don't know, but this story was really fascinating to me. I'm just really interested about true crime, in just completely, but there is something about axe murders or the Axeman. There are actually multiple Axemen. So you have the Axeman, so this Axeman, but you also have the Axeman of New Orleans. And I don't know what it is about Axemen. Their motive is often that they kill people while they are asleep with their own axe. That is actually also what happened in this case. So the axe that the murderer used was actually the family axe. So they were murdered with their own axe, and that's just, I don't know why that freaks me out so much. This case was actually one of several cases that I have actually considered not covering in this podcast, But then again, it's very interesting, so I just had to. But yeah, there are certain stories that I'm still considering whether I should cover them or not, because they just really terrify me. So, for example, you have the Interkai effect murders, which is like a murder on a farm where there's also this idea of the killer already being inside the house, like weeks and weeks before they got murdered and weeks after, or at least days. And there's also a case of a group of students who were found dead in the snow. It's a I don't know, but it's like the Russian students being found dead in the snow. And the reason why I don't want to cover that story, even though it is very strange and it is solved, so it is very interesting to cover that, is just because I saw the pictures of the pictures of like the group having fun, and then the pictures of them dead, and that is just something that I recommend you don't look up if you want to have a comfortable life. But yeah, this was a case that I actually terrified me so much that I actually considered not covering it, but I'm actually happy that I did. And especially for Halloween, it's just a very, very spooky tale, something that it is a fear that everyone has, being afraid that someone is inside your house, that someone is going to get you when you are asleep. So yeah. But thank you for listening to this first episode of Season 2 of Certainly Strange. Everything about the podcast can be found on the website certainlystrange.com. There you can find the transcript of the episode and the sources that I used in my research. And once again, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!